Violence is a theme which permeates Lord of the Flies from beginning to end. At the time the book was published in 1954, the world was already 9 years into a period of tension between the democracies of the West, led by the US, and the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, led by the Soviet Union, which became known as the Cold War. Although declarations of war were never officially made, the US and the Soviet Union fought each other through engaging in proxy wars, i.e. by supporting and taking sides with opposing nations in other smaller conflicts, such as the Korean War, and by jockeying for position as the more powerful and technologically advanced superpower through the arms race, which was the stockpiling of weapons and nuclear bombs, and through the space race, where they sought to accomplish various space missions before one another. The Cold War came to an end in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. For Golding in 1954, however, the outlook was bleak. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US in 1945 had brought about Japan's surrender in the Second World War and was a powerful deterrent for the rest of the world. By 1949, however, the Soviet Union had exploded its own atomic bomb, and the US no longer held all the cards. If these two superpowers waged an open war on one another, the whole of civilization could be wiped out in a single conflict. Golding, therefore, imagines a world where a group of schoolboys, the embodiment of innocence and hope for the future, arrives on an island as a result of such a global war, triggered by the dropping of an atom bomb. Not only is the reason for their being on the island due to violence, but the way in which they arrived there as a result of their evacuation plane being shot down is also very violent. We are visibly reminded of this throughout the novel by the presence of the scar, or the destroyed strip of land caused by the crash landing of the passenger tube. All around him, the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat. Note Golding's use of a word usually used to describe the effects of a physical injury to effectively personify the island. The way in which the island appears to have been assaulted draws our attention to the way that it is also a major protagonist in the novel, which exerts influence over the way in which the boys behave. A scar is also something that remains for a long time, perhaps permanently, conceivably symbolising the long-term cumulative effects that violence has not only on the psyche of the individual, but also on humankind as a whole. From the very beginning, the boys show that they have an innate capability for, and attraction to, violence and destructive forces, such as hunting and fire, fighting and war. Ralph danced into the hot air of the beach and then returned as a fighter plane, with wings swept back, and machine-gunned Piggy. Scow! Even this relatively innocuous and, at this point, unremarkable display demonstrates the way in which the lexicon, or vocabulary, of the boys' play is dominated by violence. Their imaginative play imitates what they see going on in the adult world. In the civilized world, this fascination with destructive forces at an early age is regarded as a natural impulse, or boys being boys, which under the guidance of the civilizing behaviour of adults remains in the realm of fantasy and imaginative play and never gets out of hand. The first sign that the situation on the island is volatile and that the boys have a precarious hold over their instincts for violence, however, comes in Chapter 2, Fire on the Mountain. Children have an innate fascination with fire. It's colourful, animated and interactive, as Golding vividly describes using a technique called zoomorphism. Small flames stirred at the bole of a tree and crawled away through the leaves and brushwood, dividing and increasing. One patch touched a tree trunk and scrambled up like a bright squirrel. The smoke increased, sifted, rolled outwards. The squirrel leapt on the wings of the wind and clung to another standing tree, eating downwards. The destructive progress of the fire through the forest has an almost hypnotic, empowering effect on the boys. At the sight of the flames and the irresistible course of the fire, the boys broke into shrill, excited cheering. Startled, Ralph realised that the boys were falling still and silent, feeling the beginnings of awe at the power set free below them. The knowledge and the awe made him savage. Here Golding is suggesting that even Ralph is not immune to the liberating sense of empowerment that experiencing violence and destruction unleashes. This fascination with fire and the fact that children have a propensity to overestimate their ability to control it proves to be a lethal combination, as Piggy is first to realise that the littlun with the mulberry-coloured birthmark is nowhere to be seen and is, in fact, never seen again. Only 2 chapters in, the boys have experienced their first violent death, effectively at their own hands. Golding explores the theme of violence through the boys' relationships with it. Jack has a predisposition to violence and embraces it from the start, seeing it as a powerful tool to maintain control, firstly within the constraints of the democratic system which the boys attempt to put in place, and then later as a means of maintaining his iron grip on his disciples through a combination of excitement and fear. This is evident right at the beginning of Chapter 2, Fire on the Mountain, when the boys are setting the ground rules for the meetings. Jack initially seems to like the idea of rules because infractions can be punished. "We'll have rules," he cried excitedly, "lots of rules. Then, when anyone breaks them..." The way in which the boys join in with an onomatopoeic chorus of whee-oh, wacko, bong and doink reflects not only the harsh discipline and corporal punishment of the school system at the time, but also the boys' unequivocal acceptance of and revelling in its violence. When Jack senses that the time is ripe to stage his coup because he has another valid object for his violent urges, he no longer has any use for rules and infamously declares, "Bollocks to the rules. We're strong. We hunt. If there's a beast, we'll hunt it down. We'll close in and beat and beat and beat." Note the way in which Golding uses polysyndeton and triadic repetition of the violent verb beat here to communicate Jack's awakening savagery. On more than one occasion, Jack slams his knife into a tree, using it as a proxy, in order to intimidate the boys by communicating his willingness to commit violent acts against others. In Chapter 1, The Sound of the Shell, Jack does this twice, the first time in order to silence the boys. Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife and clouted it into the trunk. The buzz rose and died away. And the second time as a means of communicating his frustration and shame at not being able to kill the piglet, and his determination that he will be successful the next time. He snatched his knife out of the sheath and slammed it into a tree trunk. Next time there would be no mercy. He looked round fiercely, daring them to contradict. It's clear from his reaction here that Jack sees the ability to commit acts of violence as a sign of strength. His inability to kill the piglet is an intolerable sign of weakness, which he cannot allow to cut through to the boys. When the rest of the boys are told that the piglet broke away from them and escaped, Jack assures them that it was before I could kill it, but next time. Jack slammed his knife into a trunk and looked round challengingly. What perhaps starts as a quest to save face becomes an obsession as the urge to hunt brings Jack's violent and savage nature increasingly to the fore. He tried to convey the compulsion to track down and kill that was swallowing him up. As the novel progresses, Jack's bloodlust evolves from wanting to kill pigs to the desire to kill humans, primarily for the pleasure this ultimate control affords him. His attempt to camouflage himself through the use of red and white clay and charcoal transforms itself into a mask that drew their eyes and appalled them. He began to dance, and his laughter became a bloodthirsty snarling. He capered towards Bill, and the mask was a thing on its own, behind which Jack hid, liberated from shame and self-consciousness. The mask, in removing Jack's individuality, allows him to throw off the shackles of moral responsibility and give himself up entirely to his urges. As the other boys follow suit, they increasingly become a homogeneous entity. This acting as a single being consequently absolves them from individual blame. Jack uses a potent mix of fear and exhilaration generated by the handing out of arbitrary violence to control his tribe. In a conversation between Roger and Robert in Chapter 10, The Shell and the Glasses, they discuss the fate of a boy named Wilfred. He's going to beat Wilfred. What for? Robert shook his head doubtfully. I don't know, he didn't say. He got angry and made us tie Wilfred up. He giggled excitedly. He's been tied for hours waiting. But the chief didn't say why. I never heard him. The implications of this conversation will also be key in Roger's decision to kill Piggy, as we will see later on. In much the same way that Jack's obsession with hunting develops into an overwhelming desire to kill humans, the ritual of pretending to kill the pig gradually evolves into something much more sinister through the power of mob mentality. In Chapter 7, Shadows and Tall Trees, when the boys once more fail to kill a boar, Robert plays the part of the pig in a reenactment which gets out of hand. The circle moved in and round. Robert squealed in mock terror, then in real pain. It's interesting to note that Golding uses language with sexual undertones to describe the way in which even Ralph too was fighting to get near, to get a handful of that brown, vulnerable flesh. The desire to squeeze and hurt was overmastering. There's a suggestion that the human urge to commit violent acts is as strong and as natural as the instinct to commit sexual acts, from which even Ralph is not immune. Golding more explicitly links violence and sex later on in Chapter 8, Gift for the Darkness, with the slaughter of the nursing sow reading almost like a gang rape. Jack was on top of the sow, stabbing downward with his knife. Roger found a lodgment for his point and began to push until he was leaning with his whole weight. Then Jack found the throat, and the hot blood spouted over his hands. The sow collapsed under them, and they were heavy and fulfilled upon her. The escalation from physically harming Robert to killing Simon, whom in their hysteria they mistake for the beast, is a natural progression. Golding conjures a mankind with a dual nature, and in some ways we can see parallels with the duality of Robert Louis Stevenson's characters Jekyll and Hyde, who are, of course, one and the same person. It's not as simple as good and evil for either author. Good, or moral behaviour, is a result of the repression of our baser instincts, such as our urge to commit violent acts for our own gratification, rather than the absence of these. He uses the behaviour of the boys to communicate his belief that we all have the capability for violence. A beast which lies dormant or sleeping within us, suppressed by social mores, which only needs a favourable environment, such as a world without adult intervention and discipline, and a crowd mentality, to be awoken and consume us, in much the same way as the destructive force of the fire consumes the forest in Chapter 2. Golding uses the notion of the beast as a means of exploring the way in which we project our violent urges outwards onto monstrous others, out of fear of acknowledging that they actually reside within us. Even Piggy and Ralph, arguably two of the most responsible and moral of the boys, are not immune. Swept up by the pig-killing ritual on the beach and affected by the impending storm, they too become victims of mob mentality, in which individuals lose their power to make independent decisions. Piggy and Ralph, under the threat of the sky, found themselves eager to take a place in this demented but partly secure society. In one of the most harrowing and violent scenes in the novel, the two boys participate in the mob murder of Simon, who is mistaken for the beast as he returns from the mountaintop with news of the dead pilot. A thing was crawling out of the forest. It came darkly, uncertainly. The shrill screaming that rose before the beast was like a pain. The beast stumbled into the horseshoe. Kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood. Kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood, do him in. The sticks fell and the mouth of the new circle crunched and screamed. The beast was on its knees in the centre, its arms folded over its face. Note the almost hypnotic structure of the chants and how what was once a hunting cry has become a call to kill the beast. The mob, including Ralph and Piggy, leapt onto the beast, screamed, struck, bit, tore. There were no words and no movements, but the tearing of teeth and claws. Note how Golding uses the language that has, up until this point, been used to describe the beast to describe the boy's own actions, effectively transforming this violent mob into another physical manifestation of the beast. In the cold light of day, however, Ralph and Piggy are only too painfully aware of what they have done and the taboos they have broken. They experience a phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance, which is the psychological stress that we feel when we participate in an action that goes against our core beliefs or ideals. For Ralph and Piggy, it is the discrepancy between their behaviour, i.e. their participation in the mob violence that leads to the murder of Simon, and their ideal that murder is wicked, that is causing them pain. In order to be able to live with what they have done and so live with themselves, they proceed to justify their own actions, such as blaming the fact that it was dark. There was that bloody dance. There was lightning and thunder and rain. We were scared. Minimising their involvement. You were outside the circle. You never really came in. Didn't you see what they did? And eventually blaming Simon for his own murder. Coming in the dark. He had no business crawling like that out of the dark. He was batty. He asked for it. The only way that they can come to terms with the horror they feel at their own capacity for violence is to create a narrative which exonerates them of any guilt. For Golding, the adults in the midst of a global conflict who are engaging in the mass extermination of the enemies that they too have created are no different as they seek to justify their atrocities. Golding uses the way in which the boys, and Roger in particular, interact with boulders and stones throughout the novel to examine their relationship with violence, and how its unfettered exploration enables them to commit the ultimate atrocity. The pushing of the boulder into the forest in the first chapter, The Sound of the Shell, is another example of boys just being boys. The great rock loitered, poised on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leapt droning through the air and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Wacko! Like a bomb. Weow! This event not only has obvious parallels with the dropping of the bombs in the War of the Adult Realm, but it also foreshadows the death of Piggy by another deliberately pushed boulder. In Chapter 4, Painted Faces and Long Hair, Golding describes how a concealed Roger watches the littluns and undergoes an internal battle as he fights the urge to throw stones at them. Roger stooped, picked up a stone, aimed and threw it at Henry. Threw to miss. Yet there was a space around Henry, perhaps 6 yards in diameter, into which he dare not throw. Here, invisible yet strong, was the taboo of the old life. Round the squatting child was the protection of parents and school and policemen and the law. Roger's arm was conditioned by a civilization that knew nothing of him and was in ruins. At this point in the novel, the rules and morals from the civilized world still have a certain amount of influence over him and prevent him from giving in to his baser instinct, which is to hurt another human being for his own pleasure. In much the same way that Jack initially physically freezes when he tries to kill the piglet in Chapter 1, note the way in which Golding indicates that it is Roger's arm which is conditioned, and not his heart or his mind, suggesting the superficiality of his morality. For Golding, morals, or the principles of right and wrong, rather than being innate, are man-made constructs, developed much later in our evolutionary journey than our inherently self-serving, self-gratifying primitive urges, and as such are imposed upon us by society for the good of that society as a whole. It does not, therefore, take much for them to be discarded. In Chapter 11, Castle Rock, Roger resumes his play with stones, this time openly dropping them with one hand on Ralph and Piggy who are below him, while the other rests casually and in a most sinister manner on a lever wedged underneath a big boulder. Silence and pause, but in the silence a curious air noise close by Ralph's head. He gave it half his attention, and there it was again, a faint zip. Someone was throwing stones. Roger was dropping them, his one hand still on the lever. Below him Ralph was a shock of hair, and Piggy a bag of fat. And again the clamour, and again zup. Until finally, high overhead, Roger, with a sense of delirious abandonment, leaned all his weight on the lever. Note the way in which Roger leans all of his weight, as the actions of his body and the desires of his heart are now in complete synchrony. Jack's arbitrary punishment of Wilfred in the previous chapter is a watershed moment for him, an illumination where he has been able to assimilate the possibilities of irresponsible authority. The rock struck Piggy a glancing blow from chin to knee. The conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. Piggy, saying nothing, with no time for even a grunt, travelled through the air sideways from the rock, turning over as he went. The rock bounded twice and was lost in the forest. Piggy fell 40 feet and landed on his back across that square, red rock in the sea. The way in which Roger is able to push the boulder onto Piggy with the sole purpose of killing him, rather than merely taunting and bullying, indicates how far and how easily he has fallen in a relatively short space of time. It's only as the novel progresses that we see that the harmless, imaginative play of the early chapters is just the thin end of the wedge, and without the checks and balances of adult authority, this can quickly escalate into savagery and murder. After the deaths of both Simon and Piggy, the deliberate attempt on Ralph's life, with the pushing of the large boulder onto the thicket, and, when that fails, the attempted smoking of him out through setting a fire, seems inevitable. Even before Piggy's death at the hands of Roger, Ralph is no longer a serious threat to Jack's authoritarian leadership, as the boys have definitively rejected what he stands for, i.e. the principles of democracy. For Jack, however, making Ralph an explicit enemy suits his purpose, as hatred for a monstrous other unifies the boys behind him as their leader and gives their violent urges an object. The fact that there is a stick sharpened at both ends, hinting at Ralph's intended decapitation in the same manner as the Lord of the Flies, is an indication of the true depths to which the boys have sunk. Ralph is saved just in time by the arrival of the ship, alerted by the billowing smoke, as the progress of the fire and the stampeding tribe chase him onto the beach. The island, however, is razed to the ground. The message that Golding seems to be communicating is that the brinkmanship displayed in the Cold War, and the darkness of man's heart underpinning it, i.e. mankind's predisposition to violence, risks the obliteration of civilization as we know it. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.